And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Paul Anthony Wallis, former Anglican Church Arch deacon, researcher, speaker, and international best-selling author of books on spirituality and mysticism. He researches the world's mythologies for how they speak to our origins as a species and our potential today as human beings. And today he returns to talk about his new book, The Invasion of Eden. Paul, welcome back. It's great to see you again, brother.
G'day, Jeff. It's great to be with you again.
Paul, for people that are new to my audience, can we first just talk about how you went from being an archdeacon to writing about ETs?
For sure. People today know me as the paleocontact guy, and paleocontact is the theory that our ancestors may have had contact with other civilizations, ET civilizations in the deep past. But my route into it and my background surprises a lot of people because it was 33 years in church-based ministry. And my work was as an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia, a theological educator, and a church doctor. And it was really my work as a theological educator that led me into this territory of ET contact through probing the root meanings of key words in the text. And the white rabbit that caught my attention was little anomalies in the biblical stories, things that don't quite make sense, or stories that don't quite make sense that we derive from the scriptures. And I had a period of convalescing from an injury some years ago, and I used that time to follow my curiosity, go back to those anomalies and address them from a Bible translation viewpoint. And as soon as I applied myself to the root meanings of the key words, a completely different story emerged from the familiar texts. And as I read those texts using more fundamental translations, I realized what I was reading were summary forms of the ancient stories of Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And those stories are not God's stories. They're stories about sky people, or what today you and I would call ETs. So that was what got me into this whole topic.
So were you a kind of like a sci-fi guy before all this happened? And where I'm getting at is, did you immediately go, okay, it's possibly ETs? Like, was that a particular interest for you?
So there's a bit of a longer backstory because back when I was 11, I picked up a book that my parents had left lying around in the living room by Erich von Däniken, Chariots of the Gods. And that caught my attention because he identified a gap in our ability to explain ourselves as an intelligent, conscious species that's the alpha species on the planet. And he suggested that the anomalous story of humanity might make more sense if we allowed for the possibility of external interventions, tweaking our development as a species. And that idea lodged in my brain. It made some kind of sense to me, but I didn't really do anything with that idea for decades. And then as I became a Christian at the age of 17 and then went into ministry when I was 20 and then went into theological education a little later on, I did start finding evidences that there were other kinds of entity being recalled in the ancient texts of the Bible. And again, this sort of sat in the back of my mind for a long while. And I think a catalyst for me was 2009 when the Roman Catholic Church had what it called a colloquium. Pope Benedict XVI called on the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to have a symposium of top theologians and scholars and researchers to discuss, and they told us what they were discussing. They gave a long, it was about a year's notice that this was going to happen. They'd be discussing the theological implications of contact with other species, ET species, they meant. And prior to and in the aftermath of that symposium, some very authoritative voices for the curious stepped forward and said, we should expect contact with alien brothers and sisters sooner than anyone expects. We shouldn't be surprised to meet them because they're in the Bible. They're in the Old Testament and the New Testament. That happened in 2009, and that was a little bit of a provocation to theologians all around the world to go back to the biblical texts and have another think about what we're being told there. And I filed that away. And then finally, the opportunity came with this period of convalescence to do some deeper study. And I wanted to go back and look at that because I'd seen enough in my biblical studies to know there may be a few ETs washing around in the text. But when I did the study, I was blown away by how much ET contact is in those ancient stories from start to finish, and most especially when you address these translation issues and look at more fundamental readings.
Well, I was looking at your new book, Invasion of Eden, and right on the front cover, it asks, did our ancestors warn about ET invasions? So I'm assuming they did. Can you give us examples of how they're actually warning us about them?
Well, they tell the stories of their culture. They share the cultural memory. And I found there were very surprising overlaps and correlations from ancient culture to ancient culture. And an invasion narrative is one of the overlaps. So in the Bible, you can go to Deuteronomy 32 or Psalm 82, and you've got this explanation that these Elohim have arrived. Powerful ones is what Elohim literally means. It gets translated as God in the singular, but the word fundamentally is a plural, a masculine plural, and it means the powerful ones. They're described collectively in the Bible as the Tseva Hashemayim, the sky armies. So that's how their arrival is remembered, as the sky armies. And then in Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32, we have an explanation of El Elyon, that's the powerful one, more senior than the other powerful ones, higher than the other powerful ones, partitioning lands out to the members of the Tseva Hashemayim or the El Ba'adat, the Council of Powers, so that this portion of land goes to this Elohim, this portion of land goes to this Elohim. And among those Elohim is a character called Yahweh, who is a junior Elohim who gets given a people group with no land. And so there's an engineered scarcity built into the story that then means Yahweh has to go to war with the other Elohim in order to get land and resources. So that's how it's framed in the Bible. But you can find very similar stories in other cultures. We have the Norse story, for instance, of Odin, who emerges from ancient Armenia with his group of advanced people, and we're never quite told how or why they are advanced, but it's clear they are because they move into Northern Europe, and he annexes all the lands of Northern Europe and hands them out to his sons and his underlings. So, you know, one gets Saxony, one gets this bit of Scandinavia, one gets this bit of Scandinavia, and the stories sort of run in parallel. If you go to Hawaii, as I do in The Invasion of Eden, we go to Molokai and listen to a guardian of traditional story there. He talks about what happened when the Mo'o came. And the Mo'o were these draconic entities who arrive, and you think, oh, draconic entities, this is going to be stories of damsels in distress and people being eaten and immolated. And it turns out it's a story of the annexation of land. And then the land is divided and portioned out to the different Mo'o. So there's another, for instance. And there are other cultures around the world that talk about this annexation process with our ancestors essentially just having to sit and watch while this new tier of government arrives. And it's a government that has no fellow feeling with ordinary human beings because they're actually not human themselves. The Vedas would be another place you could go for these stories, with the stories of the kings who have this airborne technology, and technology that sounds like nuclear warfare to the modern ear. And what they're doing is carving up territory and giving it to different powerful beings. And once you start reading, a lot of believers read the Bible in a bubble, but once you start reading it in the context of these other cultural stories, you realize it does fit the pattern, and that the Elohim do arrive and they conquer and they exploit, they colonize, they divvy up the land, and that is the new tier of government. Another place you could go is 17th century Scotland, where the Presbyterian minister Robert Kirk, simply by analyzing the local lore, the folklore of the Celtic people in Scotland, came to the same conclusion. And he said, you will never have a complete understanding of why the world works in the way it does until you realize that there are elites who dictate to our visible governments, and there's an ET elite that is in conversation with our human elites. And he said, you won't understand why there are these very long-lasting uber policies that transcend the comings and goings of kings and queens and elected governments, that seem to follow policies that have no sense of compassion or fellow feeling towards ordinary human beings. And he says the reason that happens is because the architects of those policies are not human.
If we get back to Odin coming from Armenia, is it possible that Odin came in the ship, which we now call Noah's Ark, and landed on Mount Ararat right next to Lake Van and conquered from there?
Well, it's so interesting you asked me that question, Jeff, because ancient Armenia is a place of so many beginnings in the human story. So we have the story of Odin, which is the beginning of the story of Northern Europe in the Norse tradition. We've got the Noah story located there because traditionally that's where we understand Mount Ararat to be, that is where the ark landed. And so that's the place from which the planet was repopulated after a cataclysm. In the invasion of Eden, I argue that the story of Abraham has its roots in ancient Armenia as well. If you read classical authors from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they noted that the Iron Age began in ancient Armenia. That's where we first learned how to work with iron. That's where we first built with stone. So there were these very significant technological advances that emerged from ancient Armenia, and it carries one of the oldest languages on the planet. And it was actually the linguistic connection that led Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. And he's the guy who we really have to credit with recording the Norse stories, which had existed for hundreds of years, but he's the one who wrote them down and explained the deep past. He identified real world evidence in the pattern of language that suggests that the Odin stories were not just fables, that they were history, that they were about real migrations that would connect Scandinavia with ancient Armenia. So there are so many firsts in that part of the world. How they connect with each other, what order they run in, is another question. And I go somewhat into that in the Invasion of Eden. And next month, I'm going to be at Lake Van to probe those questions a little bit further. So ask me again in another few months, and I'll have found out a bit more.
We refer to white people as being Caucasian from the Caucasus Mountains, which is, again, Mount Ararat. So I'm curious, what's the reasoning behind that? I thought there was a biblical one, but I'm curious to see if you have any information about that.
No, I don't, but I do wonder if it connects with this repopulation narrative, which has, it's really a big part of the cultural pride of that region. The people who live in Armenia today and the people who live in Anatolia today have a pride that that part of the planet is responsible for reseeding the human race. And that means all the ethnicities. And part of the story of Noah in the Bible is these three ethnic roots emerging from that part of the world. So not just the Caucasians, but all the ethnicities. And so the Caucasian story is just part of a matrix of stories that would take our attention back to that part of the world and ask, well, what did happen here? Something happened here. If this is where the Iron Age began, if this is where megalithic civilization began, if this is where our languages are coming from, then we ought to be putting a lot of attention onto that part of the world and asking, well, what's the history of that? There may be plenty of legend and myth, but all of that might be rooted in things that really did happen. And I'd love to get to the bottom of that.
Would it be accurate to say that the Vikings then came from Armenia originally?
Well, Snorri Sturluson, writing in the 1300s, identifies ancient Armenia as the place where Asgard was, and that was the home of the Aesir, these advanced beings. And the language is very rich, but a little bit non-specific in terms of the questions we might like to bring. I mean, we want to know why they were advanced. Were they simply more evolved human beings, or were they something else? Were they from somewhere else? Why was it that they had this fortified community up in the mountains to protect them from the general population? And then why did they want to colonize Europe from there? There's a lot of questions that the story raises, and I think it's told in a way to invite those questions. But he definitely identifies that part of the world, and he does that, as I say, relating it to real-world patterns of linguistic relationships. So yes, he talks about Asaland, which was the Norse word for Asia. But by Asia, he is actually talking about what today we would call ancient Armenia, where we would now find Armenia and Turkey.
In your book, you also talk about this archaeological finding called Haldi's box. Can you tell us about it and what's being carved on the outside of that box?
For sure. Well, Haldi's box, and I'm going to be paying it a visit next month, is a fascinating artifact. At first, it might be easy to miss its significance, because if we flashed up a picture of it, you'd say, oh, yes, I think I've seen carvings like that before. Sumeria, they carved things like that. And Babylonia and the Assyrians, they carved images that look very similar. And the images on the box are familiar. You have these very fit looking people with long beards and wings, carrying a handbag and a pine cone, surrounded with emblems of seeds and ziggurats, standing on lions to show how big and powerful they were. And there's this wonderful sense of order and balance and intelligence in the picture. And I spent some time in the Invasion of Eden considering what that symbology might mean. Now, we do find symbology like that in Lower Mesopotamia, but what's it doing up here, and how old is it? Because the antiquity of the culture around Lake Van is a fascinating question because of artifacts that have been found on the bed of Lake Van, which takes us back a long, long time and could even take us back prior to the last ice age. So the age of the images is interesting. Is this an offshoot of ancient Sumer, or is it the beginning of ancient Sumer? And then what's this story being told by this carving? Because it was clearly something incredibly important. It's carved into basalt, which is not something you can do in a weekend. I mean, if we wanted to carve a relief into basalt, we'd be using diamond grade tools or tungsten carbide. How on earth did they do that with Bronze Age or Iron Age tools? This was a major commitment to get this story etched onto this basalt box. The artist or artists who did it would anticipate that this story would last for thousands of years. And it's kind of like a time capsule. Don't forget this. This is what happened. This is what happened here. and it portrays this being Haldi. And it's one of the clues, by the way, that this is where the Abraham story in the Bible comes from. People who are Bible readers will remember Abraham emerges from Ur of the Chaldees. Ur means the high place. And you look at how to spell Haldi and you realize it's the high place of the people of Haldi that Abraham comes from. Well, this is Haldi's land. This is Haldi's region, Lake Van. And this is the story they told about him. And it's a story that looks very much like an intervention of advanced beings to reboot life or civilization on Earth. And that's really what that story is about. And that's where I go in the invasion of Eden. And it finesses this question of, did our ancestors warn us about ET invasions? Because Haldi is an invader, and Haik, the ancient king, the progenitor of the ancient Armenians, very closely associated with Haldi. He's remembered as the great conqueror. So yes, there's an invasion implied, but when we look at these images, it's more layered than that. Something amazing happened when these advanced beings came, something that takes us beyond a narrative invasion to a story of massive leaps forward in the human story. And so we begin to realize that our ancestors had a far more layered and kaleidoscopic vision of what contact with cosmic neighbors might look like and what it might bring to the human story.
When we use the word box, to me that indicates that it is literally like a box, something that's hollowed out inside. So is that stone hollow, and was there something inside of it?
That's a really good question. And it goes to what the use of this box was. Was it just an artifact to carry a story? Was it some kind of an altar? Traditionally, altars do have things inside them. They will have what I call vested objects, objects that represent authority or connection with the heavens or connection with the powerful beings who ruled over us in the past, or connections with something holy, if you take it into the Christian tradition and how altars are put together in Catholic Christianity. And so, yes, you might want to look for something inside. There's no evidence of something inside because there are no sort of entry points that I've identified. I'll take a very close look next month to see if there's any kind of clue of that kind, but it may be that the rock itself is the vested object, because there is a correlation between hotspots on planet Earth for contact experiences and dense rocks like basalt. And I just wonder if the basalt itself was the vested object in the case of Haldi's box. But as I say, these are the things I'd really like to explore next month when I'm there. But I introduce people to the box in the Invasion of Eden because I think the information it carries relates to our questions about contact today. Should we be worried by the idea of ET contact? Should we be in a state of alarm that there may be an invasion on the horizon because of all the mass sightings, of which there's been a great acceleration in the recent past? Or when we see evidence that we've got cosmic company, should we be excited and think this could mean another great leap forward for the story of humanity? What if we are on the brink of becoming a spacefaring civilization? What if we're on the brink of operating as part of a cosmic family? What could that mean for humanity on planet Earth?
I think you're reading my mind because I was just about to ask you, is it possible we're going to be invaded? On the front of your book, it asks, is history repeating itself?
There's a reason why that question is really alive right now in 2024. And that's because last year in July, there was a televised hearing. It was the Congressional House Oversight Subcommittee hearing, where 3 witnesses were interrogated, and these were David Grush, Ryan Graves, and David Fravor, about current ET contact. And there was an exchange in that hearing between them and Congressmen Andy Ogles and Tim Burchett, in which they were asked about our ability to engage with the craft that we're now seeing. So the most famous recent engagement would be from 2004, though there have been plenty since. According to a briefing paper from the Pentagon in 2021, every 6 weeks, US defense operations are interfered with by UAPs or UFOs. But the engagement everyone has seen on the TV or on YouTube comes from 2004, when the USS Nimitz tried to engage with these tic-tac craft. And so Andy Ogles and Tim Burchett say, could we catch them? No. Can we match that technology? No. Could we shoot them down if we had to? No. So they're a potential threat then. And the 3 witnesses all had to say, well, potentially, yes, potentially. And the reason they said potentially and not yes is because tic-tacs have not been shooting us down. It's been us trying to catch them, us trying to apprehend them or even shoot them down. So these particular craft that we've been seeing raise the question, should we be worried? Are they scouting in anticipation of arriving in greater force? Is this the beginning of an invasion, or is it just an observation? Are the pilots friendly, or are they adversaries? And Tim Burchett and Andy Ogles quite rightly say, if they're potential adversaries, that can't be the business of units within the Pentagon, and that information can't be their private property. That information impinges on all of us. If there's an existential threat hanging over the USA, and by inference the world, that has to be the business of Congress. And so this is the conversation they're having, which is quite legitimate, quite logical. But I think if we frame the whole question of contact with cosmic visitors as potential war or potential conflict, we're not doing ourselves any favors. That's not a war we'd be likely to win if we wanted to see it that way. I find when I listen to ancestral story and indigenous narratives of contact, stories that go back thousands of years, yes, there are alarming stories within that spectrum. There are stories of annexation and invasion, but the great majority of stories about visitors from the stars are stories about helpers coming. When our ancestors wanted to explain how did we go from living in animal subsistence on the planet's surface to becoming farmers and city builders and civilization builders, they would say it was our helpers from the stars. Whether we're listening to Aboriginal Australian story, Mesoamerican story, ancient Babylonian story, African story, Filipino story, that motif repeats. Helpers came from the stars. They taught us to be farmers. They taught us to build cities. They taught us mathematics. They taught us cosmology. They gave us advances in material science. And I think when we have that kind of a perspective, we would look at what's happening right now and say, who are we in contact with? Who are we in conversation with at a covert level? And is it possible that this is a moment we might leverage for another great leap forward in the human story? And I think we need to approach it that way, with far more emotionally intelligent questions. If it's just binary friend or foe, can we shoot them down? Then I don't think we're going to get the best outcome.
Do you think without the help of ETs, generally humans wouldn't survive on Earth? I feel as an animal, we're pretty fragile compared to the rest of the animal kingdom.
Yes, I agree. And I remember thinking this when I was an 11-year-old boy, that absent of our higher intelligence, there's no reason we should be the alpha species on planet Earth. And why are we so ill-adapted to life on Earth as a species? I mean, just take food for a start. Are you a carnivore? Well, not really. If eating raw meat is going to make you very sick and could kill you, you're not really a carnivore if you have to cook the meat first. And even eating the plants. I mean, we started off eating a small canon of foods, which included kidney beans, but you have to boil them for 12 minutes before you can eat them. Eat them out of the field, you're going to poison yourself. How are we so ill adapted? How is it that we get so ill so easily? How is it that if you or I were put out in the wilderness, we might last 3 days, 3 nights, but we'd probably have hypothermia, be sick, hospitalized, or dead by that point? Why is that? We're only going to survive if we can build a fire, build a structure, build a weapon. Our higher intelligence is the only reason we're the alpha species. So where did that come from? And as a boy, I found there was a gap in our ability to explain ourselves. The religious answer, we're God's special creation, fails to explain how come it's so obvious that we're some type of a primate. Why aren't we more different? Why aren't we stronger? Why aren't we better? And the scientific answer says, well, it's our higher intelligence that put us up at the top. And it's because of the shape of our crania, the shape of our jaws. It's because of where our eyes are positioned. How did all that happen then? How did we get this intelligence? Why do we have it and chimps don't have it and gorillas don't have it? There's a slight gap. Whereas we listen to the ancients and they will say, we developed on this planet alongside all the other life forms, but then our ancestors were tweaked. That's why we don't have any fur. Our ancestors were tweaked. That's why we're a little bit smarter. Our ancestors were provided with developed foods and fermented drinks and foods with possibly psychedelic properties that allowed us to access part of our brains that the other animals couldn't access. Suddenly, our imaginations were switched on in a way that allowed us to ask questions we'd never asked before. Can things be different to this? Could I make something that does this? And it's that curiosity that drives the human story forwards. And it's really part of mainstream paleobiology right now to consider the possibility that it was exposure to unusual foods and psychoaffective foods that turned us into Homo sapiens. And our ancients told that story thousands of years before today's paleobiologists started considering that possibility.
In your book, you write about President Eisenhower. Do you believe the legend that he really made some sort of deal with the ETs?
Well, yes, that's a great question. It's why I asked Laura Eisenhower, his great-granddaughter, if she'd be willing to read my book and compare notes with me. And in fact, she's endorsed the book and her name's on the cover. And people who are familiar with that urban myth, I hope they'll notice that and think, okay, I want a bit more information on this, because it's been an urban legend for a very long time, really since the 1950s, that President Eisenhower had contact with ET visitors and was involved in making agreements, an agreement as to how we would engage with each other at a covert level. The story dates from 1954, when President Eisenhower was on a golfing holiday in Palm Springs, and I think it was 2 o'clock in the morning, was ferried away in a little caravan of black cars. And the official story, well, the immediate story was that the president had died. And then that was quickly retracted and replaced with an urgent dental appointment. So I think the president had died was probably the locals thinking, oh my goodness, what on earth's going on? But then the official story is dental appointment, a crown has come loose and needs fixing at 2 o'clock in the morning. Since that time, the story is no, it wasn't a dental appointment. It was a meeting around exopolitics, agreements with ET factions who were present on planet Earth at that time. Where's that story come from? What is the credibility of it? Well, in 2020, we had a bit of a clue from Brigadier General Hayam Ashed. Now, he for 28 years was the chief of Israel's space security program, so it was his job to know if we were in contact and if there was any kind of a threat. And he said at a covert government level, I mean, you can't have much more privileged information than he had. And Christmas 2020, he puts out a book, The Universe Beyond the Horizon, and in that he claims we have been in contact for more than 70 years, and we have been in collaboration with some of our visitors who are overseeing the program, that's the Pentagon's program to reverse engineer materials derived from UAPs or UFOs, That collaboration's been going on, he says, for more than 70 years. Well, that takes us back to the time of President Eisenhower and to the president before, President Truman. And I argue in The Invasion of Eden that the agreements that were made with our visiting ET neighbors were made under the administration of President Truman, and that public investigation of the UFO phenomenon began to be suppressed under President Truman, that the legal apparatus for layers of top secrecy over and above the presidency, they were established in the National Security Act, 1947, signed into law by President Truman, so urgently, a matter of days after Roswell, that it was signed off-planet, one could say, in the Air Force One of the day, a plane called Sacred Cow. So there are lots of clues that it was President Truman and his administration that were making these decisions. And what happened in 1954 was that President Eisenhower was being read into the decisions that had already been made, and I think may have worked to finesse those somewhat in a way that might be better for humanity at large. And in my book, I ask if we might need to revisit the decisions made back then, because I believe we have more visiting factions today than we had in the past. And there are some clues in how our culture has shifted since the 40s and 50s that would suggest that the ET layer to human governance has not always been to our benefit. And that's why I think the question needs to be, who are we in conversation with? And are we really deriving the maximum benefit from those present who, like human beings, who have a parental attitude towards humanity, who have a protective attitude towards our planet? And the question has to be, who has our best interests at heart and who's best able to defend them? If it were just us against our visitors, well, what power would we have in those conversations? Any agreement would be a surrender. But if we've got a spectrum of company, then our decisions have to be a little bit more subtle. And that's something I explore in The Invasion of Eden.
Do you think it's possible that President Truman made a deal with bad ETs and they've been manipulating us ever since? Even the ships that could be possibly being shot down are the good ones, and under their direction, we're shooting down the good guys, even though we don't realize it.
Yes, I think all that's possible. I think it's really important for us to realize there is a spectrum of company that we have report of from our ancestors, and that we need to think very carefully, who do we need to be worried about, and who might we want to shoot down even if we can't, and who's here to help us. I do think there are clues in our culture that there has been a layer of governance that's not been helpful. So I think we've seen a lot of machinization of human society. There's been a great move to urbanization in the last 70 years, moving people off the land and into cities where they can be more economically managed. It is harder to be self-sufficient today. It is harder to work for yourself. It's harder that we work for one another. Things have been pushed far more in the direction of we're always working for higher ups. We're working for big structures. We're working for corporations. The 99% work for the 1%. I think we've seen a great shift in that direction. At the same time, seeing a rapid acceleration of technology, material science, information science, so on and so forth. But there are those worrying aspects to it. I think the digitization of the human experience, we're beginning to see how that could be a cause for anxiety too. If you fly internationally, you'll be becoming familiar with the experience that important decisions about you and your movements and your freedom are being made by machines and not by the human beings who are in the security business. And I think the further we go in that direction, where human intelligence and human intuition and human compassion are factored out of really important decision-making processes, that's worrying. But it's convenient if you're at the top of the tree, have no fellow feeling with ordinary human beings, and simply want to manage things in an easy and economic way. So I think there are those clues that maybe we need to think carefully about who's helping us at this point. Did President Truman do a deal with bad aliens? Well, again, I think it's probably more complex. First of all, it's probably unhelpful to think in terms of good and bad aliens, just in the same way it's unhelpful to think of good and bad human nations. If we think about the world in terms of good countries and bad countries, that's not a recipe for world peace. You have to get to the good of all to achieve stability and sustainability. And you have to understand what the concerns of this country are before you can really have an intelligent conversation. And I think that's going to be just as true when we're dealing with visitors from other regions of space. But the questions may have been, whose interests are closest to ours? Who likes us? Who is concerned about us? Who cares for us? But then the other factor is, who is best able to defend our interests? And those are different questions. And I do wonder if President Truman, maybe President Eisenhower, had to calculate, look, I'd love to throw all my eggs in the basket of you guys over here because you seem really nice, but you're not going to be able to defend us against these three factions over here. And these people might be less closely allied with us, but at least they can defend us. So, I mean, realpolitik is a complex thing. And I don't think it was a binary of do we make an agreement or not. It wasn't a binary of friend or foe or good or bad. It's far more layered. And I'm glad that President Eisenhower was read in the 1950s, because he strikes me as a person who actually did have the kind of intelligence and expertise and compassion to be involved in those conversations and get us a better result. And I think that might have been what was going on in 1954.
Do you think presidents are still being read in? And if not, when do you think that stopped?
No, I don't think they are being read in. It may be that President Eisenhower was the last to be read in to a great extent, because by the end of his presidency, all the legal apparatus was there to exclude presidents from these conversations. And we have had US presidents who, before their arrival at the Oval Office, have been very bullish about the question of ET contact and have said, I'm going to find out if we're in contact, and if we are, I'm going to tell everybody. I'm going to find out what the UFO phenomenon is about. When I find out, I'm going to tell everybody. And then they get into power and they're told, I'm sorry, sir, that's on a need-to-know basis. And they don't get any information. We know that happened to the Clintons, and that happened to President Carter. I think it probably happened to President Obama as well. And there are, I think, something like 17 layers of top secrecy senior to that of the president. So presidents are not read in. It is on a need-to-know basis, and we haven't had disclosure from presidents. Last year, there was a legislative attempt to give that power back to the president. There was this 64-page amendment to the National Defense Procurement Bill of 2024 that would give the power to disclose information about retrieved artifacts, present ET contact, to a presidential panel, so that it's no longer in the power of the chief of some individual unit within the military intelligence community to decide whether or not humanity deserves to know this piece of information. It would be a presidential panel. The president would have the authority, and that amendment was defeated. So it remains not the power of the US president. I mean, in theory, it is. He's got the authority of the sovereignty of the people, but that is not sufficient, it seems, to trump the authority of units within the military intelligence community. And so there's still this web of secrecy surrounding these deeply important questions.
You would think the president could just say, hey, I'm the president. There's nothing that I don't need to know. No, I need to know everything.
He could say that, but that's not how need to know is defined and understood in the world of military intelligence.
Was that legislation you were referring to? Was that the one by Marco Rubio?
Yes, that's right. That's the very one. And one aspect was to give the power to disclose to a presidential panel, and the other aspect was to give ownership of these UFO artifacts to the government. Because at the moment we're being told, and we heard this through the hearing of July the 26th of last year, we have entire craft in our possession. When I say our possession, military intelligence, entire craft. We have many materials that have been retrieved at different times and from different places. Whose property is that? At the moment, it's the property of units within military intelligence, and other units might not even know of the existence of the specific artifacts. The bill was going to say, no, that needs to be the government's property because it's so important. But again, it was defeated, and it was defeated on the basis of national security, that there are national security implications to sharing that kind of information. Therefore, it shouldn't be in the hands of the president or the Congress, which is a bit of a worrying line of argument, but it succeeded and the amendment was defeated.
Do you foresee that we're going to have open, undeniable contact and disclosure anytime soon?
Well, I think the acceleration of what we could call soft disclosure has been so great in recent years. I think that's kind of an insurance against that happening, so that if all of a sudden it becomes blindingly obvious that we are in contact, the powers can say, well, don't you remember we did tell you? We did tell you we were in contact. We did tell you we had craft. We did tell you that we're in contact with pilots. And when I say we, it's not that Kathleen Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, has stood up and made an official statement on behalf of the Pentagon saying all these things. That's not the way it's happened. What has happened is that voices from within the Pentagon have said these things with the permission of DOPSA, the Department of Defense Office of Pre-Publication Security Review, and ISIG, Thomas Monheim, the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community. So when we hear someone like David Grush saying entire craft, pilots, non-human biologics, and he is not, imprisoned for breaching official secrets laws, or he's not debunked or silenced by the higher ups, that is an unofficial disclosure from the Pentagon. It is a form of soft disclosure. And we've seen a lot of that, especially since 2017, which is when the footage of the Tic Tac engagement was leaked. And I think this is happening to try and control people's reaction. There's a bit of disclosure, and then the Pentagon observes to see the reaction. There's no blind panic. Okay, we can authenticate that and go a little further. There's this sort of two-step thing going on, so that when it becomes blindingly obvious that we're in contact, people will say, yes, I'd more or less worked that out. And there isn't blind panic. Recent polling in the States suggests that about 67% of the US population would already say, I'd more or less worked that out if suddenly we were faced with obvious contact. And I think that's the goal. They don't want blind panic, and they certainly don't want the huge political fallout that would come from a major statement. We've been in contact. We've just been lying about it for 70 years. I don't think that's going to happen. We're just going to see a continual flow of information. And on the current pattern, I think we can expect some very significant disclosures around 2026. And we'll see again, are people worried? Is there panic? And equally importantly, is our media going to pursue this story? Because they've been so quiet on the earth-shattering information that came out last year. I really would like to see more journalists of the caliber of Ross Coulthard, my fellow countryman, who really blew open the David Grush complaint that escalated into the public hearing, I'd like to see more journalists of that kind pursuing this story and saying, we need more transparency around this. We need accountability around this. I mean, after all, the trillions of dollars of black budgets that have been poured into the program to reverse engineer these materials, to turn us into spacefarers, to bring us into the conversation, that's public money. How many trillions of dollars can you spend before what you are doing with it becomes all our business? And the implications of this program and this collaboration and what comes next affects all of us. So it really is all our business. And I think the more that we can know and not panic, the more likely we're to get greater transparency and more openness around it.
I don't think that people can ever truly be ready to meet ET. We've seen all the movies, people have talked about UFOs. Once an ET is walking around here among us, we're all going to have an initial shock, whether they give us reports about it or not. So I
Yes,
feel like
that's
it's
true.
time to just jump in the pool and get on with it.
That's true. But it's interesting for me to have the contact I do with contactees and experiencers around the world. And there are far more people who have had close encounters with non-human entities than we might first imagine. I have come to believe that there is no family circle or friendship circle anywhere that if you sat them down and said, have you ever experienced anything you couldn't explain, that there wouldn't be a story emerging, and that many of those stories would be contact experiences. And when I speak to people who've had close encounter experiences, on the one hand, yes, some are very frightened and shocked, maybe sometimes even traumatized by the experience of seeing a non-human entity and knowing that's what you're looking at. But another aspect of the trauma of that is not being able to talk about it, or not knowing if you are really sane and you really did see that thing. I think part of the trauma that experiences have had to deal with over the last 70 plus years is having an experience that has been life-changing, deeply disturbing, but you can't talk about even within your family or with your friends or in society at large. And it becomes an extremely isolating experience. I think if we get into a position where there's more open contact, you take away all that traumatizing aspect. Yes, it's disturbing. Yes, it can be scary. But if we're all in the same boat and we can share the experience and talk to each other about what we've seen and heard and experienced, we are going to help each other process. We have had decades of people struggling to process because they can't do that. So at least we'll have that advantage. And in a way, we've had plenty of time to think about these things because Hollywood has been full of imagery, some obviously sensational, some designed to make it scary. I mean, we think of Invasion of the Body Snatchers or Independence Day or Mars Attacks. And other that is not. I mean, I loved the movie Paul, where we've got the small grey alien who is far more affable and like us than we might ever have thought. Or E.T. was another one that was saying, yes, this is a freaky looking being, but actually it's not so different to us. And I think Hollywood has done both those things, but I can't believe that we are less able to cope with the idea that we're in contact than our ancestors of thousands of years ago who wrote these things into their cultural story. How is it that people 6,000 years ago could say we've been in contact and we are in contact now and still be able to live their lives? If they could do it, why can't we?
I think we're ready. I don't see how we can be any more ready to actually see some sort of non-human biological being, whether it's on our television, standing
Yeah.
next to the president talking to us, or walking among
Well,
us.
I agree. Now, we've had the talk of pilots and non-human biologics in the hearing of July 26th. I think if that language gets used more and more and more, the feeling is going to be, all right, what do they look like? And there's going to be that kind of drive and that kind of curiosity. You keep telling us non-human biologics, what are they? You keep telling us pilots, what are they? What do they look like? And I think given another couple of years, and there'll be more people approaching it with that kind of a question, may be ready to see something that is confronting or strange or initially frightening and disturbing, but knowing that we're talking about beings that we're in contact with, have been for a long time, and that we're in collaboration with, according to Hamish.
I'm going to switch gears with you. You have a movie coming up with Matt LaCroix. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, well, this is why I'm going to be in the Lake Van region next month. We are going to be looking at that basalt box and other amazing sites and artifacts in that part of the world in Turkey. And we are looking to understand where that ancient culture, the ancient Ararat culture, fits in the story of humanity, what the symbology means, and how those sites and those carvings relate to other sites and information that we can find in other parts of the world. So we're going to begin there, and then we're going to travel to Bolivia and Peru and Egypt, where we know there are connections, narrative connections and hard copy connections in terms of what was carved to curate ancient memory. And so I'm excited to go and spend time with Haldi's basalt box and look at Ioannis Kalesi and Kef Kalesi and probe these questions. My appetite for this was really whetted by Matthew, who introduced me to these sites. And for me, the questions go beyond how long has humanity been on the planet? What's our true story? How old is civilization? Are there cultures who were here before all the ones we know about? But it goes to my questions about our place in the cosmos and what's the information those cultures were carrying.
Do you think really the cradle of civilization is the upper Mesopotamian valley or Mount Ararat and Lake Van region instead of the lower?
That's the argument I make in The Invasion of Eden. And I know I'm sticking my neck out here because that's not the position of the academic mainstream. But some of the reasons that have focused our attention on Lower Mesopotamia are really quite feeble and arbitrary. And they were made by people who were not necessarily the experts in their field back in the 1800s. And I give my case for why we should be looking at what was northern Mesopotamia, what was ancient Armenia, and say, no, I think a whole lot of our human story begins here. And that's where we should be digging. That's where we should be excavating. And when I say we, I don't mean that all of a sudden archaeologists and researchers from all around the world should go and hijack those sites. What I mean is we should value the archaeology that's being done there right now, value the expertise that has been developed in these regions in Turkey, listen to what has been found, listen to the explanations, and begin to connect the dots and realize what the implications are.
Well, the world's oldest winery is also in Armenia.
Another first.
Yeah. So, and again, probably to solidify your point, our Paleolithic humans were taught by ETs.
That's right. So it is a place of first foods as well, which I
Mhm.
forgot to mention. Karagadar is the place where we've identified the first farm. 1998, Manfred Hoyne and a team from the University of As in Norway and the Max Planck Institute went in and identified what they believe is the first farm that has led to civilization as we know it. Although I think we need to add to that, it's the farm that's led to civilization as we know it, Yet we do have megalithic remains of cultures that predate that. And it suggests repeating of history, which is, of course, the second line of questioning on the cover of my book, is history repeating itself in the 21st century? And there are many aspects in which that can happen. But yes, all these are reasons why I think ancient Armenia, Turkey, Anatolia, these are places of great cultural treasures that we need to give a lot of attention to in the years ahead if we're to understand our past and have the best possible grid by which to understand what's happening today.
I've stumbled across a letter that is from Pontius Pilate to Tiberius talking about Jesus. Is that accurate?
Oh, now this is a question that's come up a few times recently, and I haven't yet had time to probe it and study it, which I'd very much like to do, because I do often get asked, do I believe Jesus was a real historical person? Because if he was, we would expect to find artifacts like that. And we really don't have artifacts like that from the time of Jesus's life. All the artifacts we have in terms of literature come a degree removed, a generation after. But I do believe Jesus was a real historic person. The reason I think that is that the empire, the Roman Empire, morphed Christianity pretty quickly into its imperial department of religion. But to do that, they really had to distort the Jesus story and ignore aspects of it. And the fact that they had to distort and ignore tells me there was an authentic core that they had to try and deal with. And the authentic core was there, I believe, because there was a real historic Jesus who was somewhat inconvenient to the politics and feudalization of the empire. The things Jesus had to say about feudalism and money and tax systems were not friendly to the principles of empire. And I just don't think you would invent that kind of Jesus if you wanted an imperial department of religion. So that's one reason I believe Jesus was a real historical person whose story was then told a generation later, and then that story was distorted by the empire. And if he was a real person, we would fully expect to find artifacts like the one you suggested, which had been in very short supply, so short that it leads many scholars to suggest he didn't exist, that he really is some kind of a composite figure or fictitious figure. So I must get into that. I must study it. I think he was an historic person, and if there are evidences for that, then I'll be very happy about that. But I haven't studied it yet.
Have you ever looked up the origin of the word enlightenment? The reason why is because I think, typically we would think it is like you somehow came into all this knowledge or awareness. But is it possible that when a person became enlightened, they were literally having some sort of experience where they were in the light as well?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, yes, is the short answer to that question. You're right. Enlightenment is a very rich word when you think about it. And when you read about some of the figures who were involved in the historic period we call the Enlightenment, which was a period of intellectual and scientific progress, it's not just a story of science in the strict sense. It's not just a story of experiments, but there is a very strong mystical aspect to it as well. And many of the people who pushed that story forward were not scientists only, they were philosophers, they were experiencers, they were people who talked about altered states of consciousness, accessing higher cognitive powers. There were far more layers to their processes of exploration and discovery than just, an experiment in a lab. And some of their sources were incredibly rich. So the Enlightenment was fueled by some ancient texts, which included the Hermetic texts, which again had this holistic idea of heightening human intelligence in ways that are not just about thought and data, but states of being. Plato was retranslated at that time into Latin, and that fueled a lot of Enlightenment and Renaissance thought. Plato, again, he was a scientist, but he was also a philosopher. He was also a contactee. He was also a practitioner of altered states of consciousness. And so the idea of an experience of light from within, or being illuminated by light and downloading a new set of data, that's all part of the stories surrounding people like Plato and the narratives of Hermeticism. So yes, there's far more of a crossover going on in that word enlightenment. It touches on what we would call science, but it also touches on the wisdom of the ages. And again, the correlations of intellectual traditions, whether we're looking at African shamanism, Central or South American shamanism, or explorations of high cognitive powers in Germany in the 1500s. It really is a very kaleidoscopic picture. And you're right, Jeff, Enlightenment embraces all of those aspects of learning and discovery.
Well, I believe your new book came out just this week or last week.
Just this week.
Awesome.
This is about day 4 or day 5 of the book launch of The Invasion of Eden.
How is it doing so far?
Oh my goodness, I'm so thrilled by how this is launched. On day 1, it was #1 in about 4 categories on Amazon. It's the most gifted book in the UK on Amazon at the moment. It's #1 in paleontology, Hebrew Bible, science and religion, Old Testament criticism and interpretation. I love being in all those categories. They're quite diverse categories because when we get into the ancestral narratives, they touch on all those things. They touch on religion, they touch on science, they touch on paleontology and human origins. But what really excites me is that they touch on human potential as well. And for me, the great question is, can our lives be different? Can our lives be better than this? Can we build a happier human society in the light of all the information that our ancestors bequeathed to us? And of course, my answer to that is yes, I believe we can. And it's that really puts the fuel in my tank to write these books and put them out.
If people want to keep up with what you're doing, should they go to your website or to your YouTube channel, which I think is the Fifth Kind TV?
That's right. Well, for the book, go to Amazon and you'll find The Invasion of Eden, which is in paperback only. You can find me on the Paul Wallis channel on YouTube. I'm in the comments every day if you want to have a quick conversation with me. Find me on The Fifth Kind on YouTube as well, where we put our longer, more produced format material, The Fifth Kind. And then I have 2 websites, fifthkind.tv, where we have a bit of a community going. And my website is paulanthonywallis.com, Anthony with an H, Wallis, W-A-L-L-I-S, paulanthonywallis.com. If you'd like a longer conversation with me, go to that website, send me a message, and you can reach me that way.
Paul, before we wrap it up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Yes, I think one of the motivations behind the Invasion of Eden is that I think that fear and alarm can be very paralyzing. I think our ancestors didn't want us to go through life in that mindset, which is why they gave us the stories they did. I think we need to be very deliberate, especially in these days when we're so bombarded by information through the TV, through social media. We need to be very intentional about our state of mind and our emotional state. And I just think it's a great habit before you get out of bed, before you walk out the front door, to decide what energy you're going to bring to this day, what emotional state you're going to bring to this day, how you want people to feel after their interactions with you today, and make a decision about it. Because I think if we're passive, then we're just pushed and pulled by algorithms and the decisions of newspaper editors and TV editors. And if we let that happen, we're going to live in anxiety and funk. The moment we're intentional about it is the moment we raise our vibrational level to something that's happier and more positive. And if you go out your front door with that kind of intention, you will make people feel better around you. And if you're making people smile and they smile at you, you feel better. It's just a matter of making that decision day by day. What energy am I going to bring? What am I going to bring to the table today?
Paul, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thanks, Jeff. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.